Okay. Okay, so then the first question came from Claire. Claire, thanks for putting your name in there. How do you evaluate the success of a sprint upon completion? This is a great question. So I think about it in sort of two levels of success. When we first started running sprints at New Haircut, like most solution, I'm a software engineer by trade. So the idea of not being able to build whatever prototype we create in a sprint, right? That one of the big milestones of a design sprint is creating a prototype that you test out with people at the end of the week. And so the engineer in me, perhaps the male in me as well, viewed success of a sprint of getting validation that the prototype had been validated by the market that we put in front of. And they said, yes, I love this. This is exactly what I'm looking for. But of course, that's far from the reality of things. What really happens at the end of most sprints, especially when you're taking on really complex problems, is people are confused by the prototype. They ask good questions. They tell you that they wouldn't use it in this way, but in another way, or they'd use it to solve a different problem. Or altogether, they tell you that this is not interesting at all to them. And all of those are successful outcomes. So if you hit it out of the park, yes, one successful outcome could be that you design a prototype that people give you lots of good positive feedback on, and then you can scale from there. So then that would be a moment where if you've prototyped out enough of the experience, the next step could be that you bring in your execution team, your delivery team, your implementation team, right? And they start designing and building the actual version of that product or service. That could be your MVP or your version 1, and you take it to market from there. What I'm saying is, more realistically, what will happen is that you'll have lots of gaps and interesting insights and new ideas that come out of testing that first prototype. And from there, what you can decide to do is what I call run iteration sprints. So that would be a smaller, more compressed version of the sprint, where you may just start by going through the insights and the feedback from that first group of people that you tested out with, pulling out the insights, the interesting ideas, the gaps in what you had missed, and then recreating or building on or sort of pivoting your prototype, and then running another round of tests with a different set of users. That would be what I call an iteration sprint. The first sprint I call a foundation sprint. And then in another scenario, you may put your prototype from your foundation sprint in front of the users, and they tell you not interested at all, in which case you would go back to leadership or to whoever, sort of like the decider. I don't have deciders in my sprints, but whoever sort of initiated the sprint, and say, what we learned is that we shouldn't pursue this, which is a great outcome, because in a couple of days, you disqualified the company spending tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, or your local currency, of pursuing an idea that there's no market for. And so all of those are great outcomes, and all of those I consider success. What I would consider a failure of a sprint is if you as the facilitator are completely unprepared, you have the wrong team in the room, you don't have enough research for them to understand the challenge in front of them, they're misaligned on the challenge, right? And basically you cannot have the conversation in order to get to the end of the sprint. That to me is a failure of a sprint. And I've been there. And the more you run sprints, the more you understand what you need to do to be prepared, to prepare your team. One of the ways I do that, one of the big tools I use to do that is to a framework or a process I call problem framing. And for me, it's a 1 or 2 day process, but it takes some work and some prep ahead of time. If you're interested in learning more about framing, you should come to one of the AMAs that I have on problem framing. The next one is, I think, May 19th, 2 weeks from now. So I hope that was helpful, Claire. If you have any follow-ups, please leave another little post-it nearby and I'll come back to it. Okay. Let's go to question number 2. I saw one up here by Noi, Claire's counterpart. Noi's question is, how do you balance input between team, stakeholders, and users. Okay. Feels like I have a tactical answer to this and maybe one that's not as tactical. So one of the principles of design thinking, and so the relationship between design sprints and design thinking, another popular question I hear, and I also had many times, I consider what I define design sprints as a recipe of design thinking. And because of that, design sprints inherit a lot of the principles of design thinking. And one of those principles is an opportunity for the group to think independently, right? Or to allow the group to diverge and to go off and do some thinking, whether still in the same shared space or off on their own, and then come back. So doing some asynchronous thinking. Later in this session, I'm going to show you a resource that I created with another group of folks to what it looks like to think asynchronously and remotely. But back to this question. So allowing the group the members of the group to think individually is one of the really important parts of any design thinking, any sort of good design thinking driven ideation session. And so by doing so, you allow everyone in the room, whether they're a team member, a stakeholder, a user, maybe a user that's been invited to do some ideating. And in that way, it's unbiased. So when you come back together and you look at all those ideas, it really doesn't matter what the person's status or title is. If they've all been, we've all been informed of the challenge, right? We've seen the research, we've had the conversations, we understand the challenge and what's in front of us and what's important to the company. If there's a company supporting this sprint, then all of our ideas should be on equal footing, with our own mental models and perspectives of how the world works. And that's the power and the value of a sprint, bringing all these people together in a structured conversation to put their best ideas forward based on what they're hearing and seeing, all in the vein of what's best for the customer. And so what happens outside of a sprint, right? Like if you think of a classic brainstorming session, what tends to happen when you don't have someone facilitating the conversation and allowing for those divergent moments, you get the senior vice president that stands up and does most of the talking, and folks just kind of follow along, and now they're biased with that person's opinions. And so that's a big part, when I think about your question, that's a big part of how I make sure to balance everyone's input. But if there was something more specific or a different flavor of your question that you want to hear more about, I'll come back to it. Maybe what I can speak a little bit more about, though, is team versus users. So stakeholders could be inside or outside, I suppose. But inviting users into a sprint, I think there's a few moments before the sprint, right? So I'll do my own sort of heads down research, or if there's a researcher that I'm working with from the group, I would build on top of their existing research. So if there's a targeted persona that we're going to be solving for, then I would understand who that person is, how they experience the problem as it is today. So there's moments to learn from that user before, and then there's moments at the start of the sprint itself where you're inviting them into the process and you're sharing them with them the challenge that you're solving and asking for them, what are we missing? What should we know? What are the hard parts? And that is good information to seed any kind of ideas that come from the group in the sprint. And then at the end, of course, the users come in and they evaluate your prototypes. And that's where you have really structured interviews and you can ask them for their ideas and their feedback based on the ideas that have been generated by the group so far. So there's sort of these 3 milestones for users or customers or fans or patients to come in and share with you their ideas about the problem that you're trying to solve. So that was part 2 to your question.
Yeah, thanks so much for your
Okay.
feedback.
All right. Let's see. Here's another one down here. Oh crap. Sometimes I get confused if I'm in Miro or Mural. Mural has a highlighter feature, so I don't know if Miro does. But I'm in the pre-sprint arc. The highlighter feature, you can hold if you're a Mural user, you can hold the H key and you can drag your cursor around. Oh, I see. With Miro, that turns it into a hand. But with Mural, holding the H key turns it into a highlighter, so you can show people where you're at on the board. So if I zoom out, I'm in the pre-sprint and I'm just going to wave this sticky around. I could also summon you, I suppose. Okay. So the point of me completely going off track, can someone, whoever asked this question, can you just go in here and drop your name so I know who you are? Cool. When do you require the sprint? I mean, at what stage of product development? Yeah, really early. So way before there's there's an ideal answer, and then there's a more realistic answer to this. So in the ideal version, I'm running sprints before there's any commitment of dollars, and team, and resources to whatever challenge is being solved. So in the world of safe, scaled, agile framework, I don't know what the E is, something that a large consultancy came up with, a way to implement agile as a framework and bring in some customer insights. What they did is they developed this thing called Sprint Zero. And Sprint Zero is the first sprint in a series of sprints. And it's at that point that a group does some shared learning, prototyping, understanding of anything that they're going to build, design and build in sprints 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, until you're out to market. My big challenge with that is there's a lot of pressure on the team, right? So like there's a series of people and sprints and budget waiting for the output that comes out of sprint zero, which would be a design sprint in this sense. And like we talked about from Claire's question, a very valid outcome is that you shouldn't move forward, or that we have to go do more research. And so there's a lot of pressure to deliver and to get it right, and to validate everything, and to go, and there's a time component to it. So I don't agree at all with the Sprint Zero methodology or ideology, but in actuality, that's kind of how the world works. And people need to plan based on time, and there's project managers and program managers that have dozens or hundreds or thousands of people that are waiting for their next project and their next assignment. So they work based on timelines and availability. That used to be me, so I understand it. So in the real world, it probably works closer to what a Sprint Zero is like. The important part of your question is that it should happen as early and before any sort of execution work is scheduled to begin. Because again, going back to Claire's question, what most likely will happen after your sprint is that more research has to happen, more prototyping has to happen. Doesn't mean infinitely and forever, especially since if you think about it, in the traditional product development world, the world that I came from, product development timelines were 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. We're talking about days. So if you can buy yourself some buffer between when you run your sprints and when design and development execution is scheduled to begin, if you do invalidate the problem that you're working within, then there's an opportunity for those teams that were scheduled to start designing and building to go and shift and go into another project. So it's really early on in the process. I don't have it in front of me, and it'll take me a minute to find it, so I'm not going to look for it now, but you could Google the double diamond process, which is a good visual to sort of understand what human-centered design looks like, at least in the eyes of a designer. So the diamond on the left is all about problem validation. So that's where you're doing your discovery, your research, your market analysis, maybe competitive analysis. You're doing some problem identification and discovery. Sprints sit in the solution validation side, but the whole diamond like only to the very far right of the second diamond do you start to get into execution of ideas. So sprints sit in that very early, just the opening part of that second diamond. And that's all about solution validation. So if you're still validating that the solution has merit and has legs and is something that should be invested in, probably shouldn't be coupled too tightly with execution. That's how I see it. Thanks for putting your name in there, Kushal. Okay. All right. I think I got them all. So if there's more questions that come in, there's plenty of time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend 5 minutes or so showing you just a couple things. And if you had to hop afterward, I'll show these to you now so that you have them. And what I'll also do after this is I'll send a quick recap email with links to some of these things so you can follow up afterward. What I've done is I developed 2 toolkits, really 3, but well, the 2 that I'm interested in sharing with you. The one is the Design Sprint Toolkit, super relevant to this AMA. So what I did was I used to run lots of training workshops where I would come in for a day or 2 days and people would attend to learn how to run design sprints based on what I knew and what I had learned. And many of the questions I would get were, what happens in this setup, in this context? Or questions like, can we have your slides? Can we have the decks that you shared with us? Can we use the templates that you had just kind of like given us a sneak peek to? And I had always not had a good answer to that until now. So what I've done is I've combined the training, so the learning and the coaching that I would offer to people that came to my paid workshops, along with all of the resources that I use to this day to run sprints. So the templates that I run, especially today in today's day and age where everything is virtual and remote. So all of the digital templates that I use to organize the sprints, the decks that I use to help team members follow along with the process. I've also created facilitation guides for the person, maybe like yourself, that wants to step into leading sprints. And so the toolkit is really engineered for you, for that person, the person that wants to take charge and say, I think we should start running sprints. I'm curious. And before I do, I would like to learn, see, and feel what how the sprints are gonna look like. So the toolkit gives you all the learning and all the resources and templates so that you're not starting from scratch. And so what you're looking at is just like a summary page of where the toolkit lives. You can see there's 19 videos in there. So most of those are me coaching you through the process, what you need to know, what this is going to look like, how the conversation is going to go. And then there's a whole bunch of files. And so what files include are customizable agenda. So you can see how you can break down your time over days with each activity. So it's timed. And then you can customize it as you see fit. It was designed in a tool called Session Lab. So you can design it and tweak it to fit for your sessions. Many groups don't want to run 5-day sprints. They want to run 3-day sprints. So you could customize it around all the digital templates as well. So there's versions for Mural as well as Miro. And so there's several templates included. I'll just show you quickly. These are the Miro-based design sprint templates. And so you can see that there's a pre-work template. There's 2 versions of the ideation template, which I'll share with you in a sec, what that looks like. And then there's a design sprint testing template, which includes some changes and upgrades I've made to the design sprint testing process. So I'll just show you what this looks like. So this would save you a decent chunk of time from having to design this off on your own. So there's some notes within here of how to use the toolkit, how to make use of the template itself. And then once you get in there, it's all set up for you. So you can just basically run your sprint. It's a lot. Sprints are hard. So there's a lot of stuff in here to capture all of the different activities that go through the sprint. And you can see that there's some breadcrumbs to show you where you're at. So sprints are 5 stages. So there's an activity and a space within the digital templates for each: understand, ideate, decide, prototype, and test. So the boards are in there. What else is in here? Presentation deck for the team to follow along with, including some font files, because I've learned that people want to even customize the presentation deck. There's an interview script for running your testing of your prototype, along with the user interview guide. And then you can see here are all the videos to help you through all the different parts of the sprint itself. If you go to this link, which is at the, I'll show you where this is at. What I'm looking at right now is this link down here in the Miro board. So if you click on that and then you click this little source thing, it'll take you to that page. And there's a couple links in here that you can preview, so you can see what the videos are like and some of the other things. How it works is it's hosted in a tool called, in a platform called Podia. So Podia allows you to stream all the videos from your browser. You don't need to download them or anything. And then it allows you to download all of the files. So that's everything included in the toolkit. This toolkit is $4.95. You pay once for that, and then it's yours. And the way it works is whenever I make updates to the toolkit, they go back into this platform and you have access to the latest and greatest. So it's kind of like software. That is the Design Sprint toolkit. I also have a problem framing toolkit if you're interested in problem framing, which is very much the same structure and benefits of the Design Sprint toolkit, except for problem framing. And they work independently, but they're also great to pair up. And if you decide to purchase both, there's a bundle that you can get on our website under Design Thinking Toolkits. I'll show you where that is. Right here, Toolkits Overview. Just down here is a bundle. I'll put this in the chat. Okay, that's my quick tour of the Design Sprint toolkit. So let me get back to the board and just see if there's any other questions. Okay, none quite yet. So let me just share a couple others with you. Next Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern, my buddy Richard Banfield, who's VP of Design Transformation at Envision, invited me to come talk about sprints. So, it's kind of about sprints, but it's mostly about remote collaboration and facilitation as well, and how to structure conversations, ideation, whether it's about ideation or strategy or discovery or visioning, when really just groups of people getting together and having conversations. So we're going to have a conversation about this next week. We're going to play a little game to visualize what we mean by some of the terminology and what this looks and feels like. So if you're interested in signing up for that, I'll also drop a link to this in the chat. This will also be in the recap email that I send out. That's next Thursday. It's a free event. Other thing I wanted to share with you is this thing. So if you're interested in sprints and your team is not working in person yet today, or if you're moving toward a hybrid setup where some of the team is going back into the office and others are remote, or if you're still fully distributed, fully remote, I was invited to an event hosted by Google called Relay. It's their fourth annual event. And what we did this year is we split up into groups. So the group was comprised of all the folks around the world that are design thinkers, facilitators, people using sprints to solve cool, wicked problems. And it's hosted by my friend Kai Haley, who works at Google. And she organized this session this year. And what she did is she split the larger group into smaller pods. And my pod, the topic that we had a conversation about and came up with ideas and resources around, was what it looks and feels like to facilitate asynchronously. And in the world of remote and online, there are more moments where the group is not together, whether physically or even doing a shared activity at the same time. As you start to shift to remote, there are more opportunities, but also just more of a reason to allow people to go off and do things on their own. But if you don't design it well, it won't work well. So what we did was we put together all of the ideas and the challenges that we faced around asynchronous work, asynchronous and remote work. And we put together this resource, which you can get at this link, which is put in the chat, also in the recap. And what it does is it gives you a whole bunch of ideas for you. If your work, if you're living on Earth and you're working with people that are not in your physical same space or working in different time zones, I think you'll really appreciate the work that this group put into this. One cool thing that I personally worked on within the group is we said, imagine that you only have 2 hours together on, different days of the week. And so what we did is we looked at the design sprint and we said, what would be the most important things to do synchronously together versus asynchronously? And it breaks down by phase and by day. So this is the first time that I think I've ever seen a group make it very black and white about how best to use your time if you are remote and asynchronous. So that's another resource for you. And let's check back in on the board. Okay. All right. You guys are in listening mode. One more thing that I'll share with you. Subscribe. If you're interested in staying current with the events that I'm doing and offering like this AMA or like the Envision, you could sign up for our newsletter. In there, I share one big idea that I'm thinking about each week, just because my attention span, maybe it's human of me, but my attention span drifts as soon as there's more than one thing to think about. So each week I unpack one big idea that would be interesting for UX and product leaders. And this week I talked about this project that I did, this asynchronous work. And then I also share in there events that are coming up. Some of them are new haircuts, but many others are things that are being hosted by other groups. And then I also post some open roles based on people that I'm friends with that are hiring or things that I see posted in Slack groups and elsewhere. And I just organize a few that catch my eye that I think would also be interesting for UX and product leaders. And I also share a little bit about what's going on in my personal world. This past Saturday was my older son's 13th birthday. So that's how you can follow along with the work. And if you're interested specifically in finding out about events that I have coming up, just hosted by New Haircut, we post them on our page here. So you can see here's today's. Next 2 Wednesdays from now, we have an AMA on problem framing, and then this repeats in 2 weeks from then, June 2nd, June 16th. All right. How are we doing? What other questions do y'all have about design sprints?
I've got another question for you. Claire, can you hear me?
There's only a few of us in here, so if it's easier, you want to come off mute, feel free to jump in there, and then we can capture or post it for it later.
Can you not hear me? Does this thing have a mic? I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I love granting time to people. So if there's no other questions for today, then we can wrap up. Oh, there we go. No problem, Claire. Okay, Claire just asked one. So have you engaged in co-design sessions with your users and stakeholders? Yeah, I have. I think it's great to invite a user or customer or fan or patient into any kind of ideation session. Design sprints don't make specific mention of, right? I think the only distinction between, for me, and tell me if I'm wrong or if you disagree, Claire, I think the only distinction between a co-creation session and a design sprint, well, maybe there's a bunch of different changes, but in terms of inviting the users into it, I think the only difference is that textbook sort of traditional sprints didn't make specific mention of having users join your session, but I think it's a great idea. The only thing to consider or to keep in mind is if those people join your session, you of course can't test those ideas out on them at the end of the sprint, right? You need people that are completely unbiased and sort of just are aware of the problem, but don't know about the solutions that you're working on. But I think it's amazing to have people impacted or otherwise motivated by the charter of a sprint, right? And those could be stakeholders that are invested in it, could be board members, could be shareholders, could be users, investors, partners, competitors, right? So there's lots of different folks that are interested in the outcomes of a sprint besides just the user or the customer themselves. A good follow-up question that I get from that, it's sort of like a fast following worry that comes from senior leadership, is as you're beginning to flex these new muscles, the legacy way of working is not to share anything with the customer until you're ready, until it's perfect. And so senior leaders or business leaders or people unfamiliar with the way that design thinking unfolds are very hesitant to put untested, unproven ideas in front of their customers. And that's just a mindset that you have to work through and prove that this is just about learning. The more they're involved, those users and customers are involved in the early parts of the process, the better the products are going to be, the faster we're going to get to market, the less of a chance of refactors, rebuilds, complete pivots. Pivots are really hard. It sounds like such a simple word, but in my experience, even after a week, groups are already attached to their ideas and don't want to pivot or change. And so it's much easier to get their input earlier on than changing everything. Yeah, so I like inviting users as early into the process as possible. And what I tell people is, what I'll share with those people is that this is just about learning. We're not even sure if we're going to move forward with these ideas, right? Even if it's an existing product and we're trying to make it better, even then, we're just learning. We're trying to improve the product. We'd love to have your input and your ideas as part of this process, but we may decide not to move forward with it. But again, we'd love to have your perspective as we're thinking about making this thing better. Good question. Okay. You don't celebrate Cinco de Mayo. The celebration of liberation. Oh, well, that's a reason to celebrate liberation. Didn't realize. No worries. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, Ruby asked a question as well. I'm new to the sprint world. Do you hold workshops for, this is just a general question. Do you hold workshops for newbies? Yes and no. I hold these for, you're not a newbie. I think you're just learning. You're a different part of your journey of learning. That's a nicer way to put it. So I hold these. I hold sessions like the one that I'm doing with Envision here. What else do I do? I created a toolkit for newbies. I just said I wasn't going to call you a newbie. So I create resources, whether it's an article, whether a free article, a video, a toolkit that is something I charge for. But I also have this thing. So really the underpinning of the success of a sprint is how well it's prepared and orchestrated. So the facilitator, in my opinion, is the most important person in any kind of group conversation. I'm sure you've been in meetings and workshops that you're like, what is going on? That is one that has not been designed. I've run many of those ones that have not been designed well. So if facilitation, like design sprint is the framework and the facilitator is the person leading that conversation or that framework. So facilitation is the skill that is really like, if that's the real challenge for you, Ruby, like how do you show up, how do you design, how do you prepare, how do you make others feel invited, how do you manage energy, balance politics and bias? Sounds like a lot. that is what great facilitators do well. So if you want, you can join. Wait, let me give you the bit.ly for this. You can not join, you can follow along with this series that I create. It's a bi-weekly-ish video series where I interview other UX and product leaders. And we talk about facilitation. We talk about the challenge of innovating, not only innovating products and services, but innovating how people show up and work. We talk about design thinking, design strategy, things of that nature. That's another resource as well. And let me just check. I think it's in here. It's not. All right. Note to myself that I will go in here. Ruby, you should check out some of these resources. The Design Sprint app, Duco is a Design Sprint app that we created years ago. So it's a little outdated. And there's videos that I created like 4 or 5 years ago that I probably I'd say like half of them, I probably disagree with myself and what I talked about, but it's a good start. And you should also read the Sprint book by Jake. There's also this Design Sprint checklist. So I've created a lot of things. There's a video in here, preparing for your first design sprint. That might sound like something that you're interested in. Also something that's really, really super old. So I don't know what I didn't know at the time. But yeah, there's a bunch of stuff in here. I'll be sure to add the facilitator Q&A video series. And then the last thing for you. I've got all sorts of things to share with you. This thing. I'll put this in the chat and also I'll drop it into. I also created this facilitation mini course. So whereas the facilitator Q&A is like an open conversation with myself and other people, although the first 10 episodes are just me talking. And then since then it's been me talking with other people. This facilitation course is it's 30 lessons that I've learned about facilitation. And I send you 1 lesson per day in your inbox. So that could also be another way for you to level up your facilitation skills. Okay. Yeah, well, that's great. Ruby said that she was just through a sprint and that she has more questions than answers, but perfect. That is a great outcome. And I hope that others are curious and willing to work through it and ask questions. I coach facilitators, and one thing I'll catch them on and call out is they're asking me to coach them because they want to get it right. And what I encourage them to remember is that the sprint even itself is a meta form of design thinking. And so if you take into it a mindset of, I'm here to learn and I'm here to build on top of wherever we end today is the starting point for my next sprint. And it's not about winning, to go back to full circle, back to Claire's first question. It's not about winning. It's not about having all the ideas and everything perfectly figured out, but it gives us the foundation to run our next sprint even better and to continue on. And it's a journey, so you run 20 sprints and then reflect back to where you were after your first sprint. And I'm very confident that you'll feel amazing and you will not be calling yourself a newbie anymore. But take the pressure off yourself to get it right. Cool. Thanks for asking additional questions in the chat. Thank you. Okay. Cool. Like I said, I'm going to send a recap email. Please continue the conversation with me. It's going to come from me, from my email. If you have follow-up questions, I may invite you to come back to a Design Sprint AMA. If I can quickly answer it over email, I will. If you're interested in having me as a coach, there's a place on the website that you can go to check out the coaching that I do and I offer. And otherwise, the Design Sprint Toolkit, again, not to push the thing that I charge for. It's not a lot of money. It's $495. It's probably 5 years worth of my knowledge and expertise. But if I could have started with that thing 5 years ago, I would have taken full advantage of it. So if you want to check it out, spend some money on upgrading, but I also encourage you to go through these other free resources as well. All right, let's get out of here. I'm gonna go eat. I'm starving. Thank you all for being here with me. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the great questions. And like I said, please reach back out, connect with me on LinkedIn, and let's continue talking. Thanks, y'all. Have a great Wednesday.